For 30 years, I lived as the invisible child, and I thought I had gotten used to being overlooked. But my father's tearful phone call at 78, and the 47 seconds of silence that followed when I asked about the daughter my parents had always been so proud of, exposed the truth my family had spent decades pretending not to see. My name is Tori Young. I'm 52 years old. And if there is one role that has followed me through most of my life, it is this, the invisible child. I was not abandoned in the literal sense, and I was never openly cast out. I was simply the one who always came last. The one everyone assumed would be fine, would understand, would cope on her own. In my family, the name spoken with pride was always my older sister's. Victoria, she was the hope, the success story, the one my parents believed deserved every investment, every opportunity, every favor. I was just Tori. No glowing title, no grand expectations. No one looked at me with that special kind of faith, as if I were destined to become something extraordinary. For 30 years, I lived beside that imbalance the way you live, with a shadow that never leaves your shoulder. I worked, got married, built a life with my own two hands, and kept telling myself I did not need to compare. I tried to believe that growing up meant no longer needing to be seen. But deep down, some part of me still hurt. It was not just about money, not only about gifts or the support I never received. What I wanted most was the feeling that I mattered too, that my effort deserved to be acknowledged as well. Then, 3 weeks ago, when my father called me at 78, crying so hard he could barely speak, everything began to shift. One phone call, one question, and 47 seconds of silence shattered the way I had understood my family for more than half my life. The truth is, it all began long before that phone call. Back in the summer of 1989, when I was 15 and Victoria was 18. That day, our house seemed to glow with my parents' pride in her. They threw her a going-away party for college. Though party hardly captures it. To me, it felt more like a small coronation. There were around 40 guests, catered food, brand new tablecloths, and a huge banner hanging across the living room that read, "Congratulations, Victoria, future business leader." I remember every detail clearly, because I was not the one being celebrated. I was the one carrying trays of food, refilling drinks, clearing plates, and wiping spills off the table. That morning, my mother handed me an apron and said in a calm, matter-of-fact voice, "Make yourself useful. Today is your sister's big day." I listened and did what I was told, the way I always did. Throughout the party, I was not seated at the main table. I stood in the kitchen, wolfing down a few bites whenever I could between trips back and forth. Then my father stood up to give a speech. His voice broke with emotion as he proudly announced to everyone that he and my mother would be paying $40,000 for Victoria's full 4 years of college. Everyone applauded. My sister cried tears of joy. My mother beamed. And I stood in the kitchen doorway, still holding a dish towel, like hired help in my own home. That night, after all the guests had left and I had washed the last stack of dishes, I finally found the courage to ask my father the question I had been holding in all evening. I asked about my college fund. He did not even look up. He just brushed me off, saying they would deal with it later. That college was not for everyone, and that I was more practical. That answer did more than disappoint me at 15. It revealed a pattern that would continue for decades. I still remember standing in my father's office, my hands clenched together, waiting for him to look up at me. But he never did. He just kept his eyes on his paperwork and said, as casually as if he were stating a simple fact, that not everyone was suited for the academic path. He told me I was practical, that I would probably do better following a simpler, less expensive road. He said it like an objective observation, but to me it felt like a sentence that had been decided long before that moment I was not worth investing in. 3 years later, when I truly wanted to enroll in nursing school, I brought up the college fund again. This time, my mother answered. She gently placed her hand over mine, with a softness that made her words hurt even more. She told me my fund had already been used for Victoria. She said it as if it were just a reasonable family calculation, not the theft of one daughter's opportunity to make up for the others. Then she added that nursing school cost less than a 4-year university, so I would surely be able to manage on my own. What stunned me most was how calm she was. They did not see it as unfair. They genuinely believed it made perfect sense. I did not cry in front of them. I simply told myself, quietly, that if no one was going to make a path for me, I would make one for myself. But deep inside, I knew something had broken. Not my dream of getting an education, but my faith that my parents would ever treat their 2 daughters fairly. From that moment on, I began to understand that in their eyes, Victoria was the future worth investing in, while I was the dependable backup plan, useful but not worth nurturing. They believed I could take care of myself, and that belief became the excuse they used to never take care of me at all. So I did take care of myself. I worked 2 jobs for 3 years to pay my way through nursing school. At night, I waited tables in a diner. During the day, I handled paperwork in a medical office. My life back then was a string of back-to-back shifts, rushed meals, aching feet, and months spent counting every dollar of tuition. No one laid out a path for me. No savings account was waiting in my name. No brand new car arrived as a graduation gift. Every step forward cost me my own time, my own strength, and my own dignity. Meanwhile, Victoria graduated with a business degree without carrying a single dollar of student debt. My parents even bought her a car as a graduation present. I still remember the day it was driven into the driveway. My mother looked at it as if it were a medal, and my father smiled with the pride of a man watching his investment begin to pay off. I was not jealous of the car. What hurt was the way they looked at her with such open pride, while they looked at me as if I were simply a strong girl who could carry a little more of life without breaking. During those years, I also learned how to become competent in silence. I did not complain. I did not call home to say I was exhausted. I did not ask them to share the weight I was carrying. Maybe part of me already knew they would not. Maybe I was afraid the answer would once again be, "You're practical. You'll figure it out." And slowly, I turned endurance into part of my identity. I became the reliable one, the one who never caused trouble, the one who always found a way. But every time Victoria was lifted up while I had to brace myself alone, a small part of me quietly asked, why did I have to be strong? Simply because no one ever chose to be gentle with me. Then came 1998. When Victoria got married, and I saw yet another clear example of where I stood in my family's order of importance. My parents spent $85,000 on her wedding. It was lavish, polished, and full of the kind of pride my mother could talk about for years with pure delight in her voice. She always said a daughter only gets married once, so everything had to be perfect. And of course, the daughter in that sentence was never me. I was a bridesmaid in that wedding, and I paid $400 out of my own pocket for a dress I knew I would never wear again. When I asked whether the bridesmaids' costs would be covered, Victoria just laughed and told me to put it on my credit card. It was not that much, she said. 3 years later, when Marcus proposed to me, my parents handed us a check for $2,000. My father slid it across the table, as if he were being extremely generous. then said that Marcus was practical, so he probably did not need a big wedding anyway. There was that word again. Practical. As if it could replace love. As care. Or the feeling of being someone worth cherishing too. My mother did not come to my wedding dress fitting because she was busy helping Victoria move into her new house that day. The same house my parents had helped her buy with a $50,000 down payment. My wedding, meanwhile, had about 60 guests and was held in a backyard. With food brought by family and friends. It was warm. Sincere. And I was grateful for Marcus. But on my own wedding day, I still felt an emptiness nothing could fill. If you have ever known what it feels like to always come second in your own family, comment the number 1 so I know you truly understand that kind of pain. Because back then, what I needed was not an expensive wedding. What I needed was to be seen as a daughter who was worthy of pride, too. The $50,000 my parents put toward Victoria's house is something I will never forget. When I asked why she still needed that kind of help when her husband was already a lawyer, my father simply said it was an investment in their future. They were just starting out, he told me. I stood there listening, trying to keep my voice calm. But inside my head only one question kept repeating itself. Marcus and I were living in a cramped one-bedroom rental apartment, saving every dollar we could just to stay afloat. No one helped us with a down payment. No one said our dreams were worth investing in, too. On my wedding day, I remember standing under the sunlight in that backyard, watching my father dance with Victoria at the small reception. My mother hovered around her, worrying about whether her shoes were hurting her feet. Even though it was my wedding, I smiled, greeted guests, thanked everyone, and tried not to let anyone see the lump rising in my throat. I had told myself so many times that it did not matter, that I did not need their money, that I was grown and could take care of myself. But deep down, what I truly needed had never been money. I needed to be seen as someone who mattered in this family, not as the child who could always give way, always endure, always live with less. I carried that feeling with me for years. It did not explode into anger right away. It settled into me as a quiet sadness, a constant sense of something missing. I kept living, kept working, kept building a home with Marcus. But part of me still looked toward my parents with the naive hope that one day they would finally see that I had grown into someone strong, kind, and worthy of pride. I had no idea it would take more than 20 years and a late-night phone call for all of it to finally rise to the surface. For all the years that followed, I kept trying to live as if I no longer needed anyone's approval. I became a nurse, then specialized in elder care. I loved my work because in that world, my presence truly mattered. The patients I cared for needed me, saw me. I trusted me. The irony was not lost on me. I received more recognition from strangers at the end of their lives than I ever did from my own parents. I built a life with Marcus, saving carefully together, creating a home, a little financial security, and a quiet but decent life. I became a mother and raised my children with all the tenderness and attention I had secretly longed for when I was young. And yet, every holiday, every family gathering, that old feeling of being second still came back. Victoria was always the center of gravity. With her stories, her needs, her cries, all the things that made my parents direct their full attention toward her. I, meanwhile, was simply assumed to be fine. If I succeeded, it was treated as expected. If I carried heavy things in silence, it was because I was reliable. Because that was just who I was. No one asked if I was tired. No one was genuinely curious about what I had sacrificed to build the stable life I had. There were times I told myself I should just accept that role. Maybe this was simply how my family worked. And maybe being an adult meant giving up hope that it would ever be different. But the truth is, no one ever fully gets used to being overlooked. You can keep going. Keep working. Keep smiling. But somewhere inside there is still a child waiting to be called by name with pride. I waited a very long time. I thought that day might never come. Until 2:17 on a Tuesday morning, when my phone rang and my father's name lit up the darkness. I stared at the screen for 3 seconds before answering, with no idea that from that moment on, my family would never again be able to keep its old facade intact. The moment I said, "Dad," what came back was not his usual controlled voice, but crying. Not restrained emotion, but real sobbing. Rough and panicked. In 52 years of life, it was the first time I had ever heard my father cry. My heart nearly stopped. He told me my mother had fallen in the bathroom, that he had heard the crash but could not lift her, that there was blood, that he did not know what to do. He was out of bed before I was even fully conscious of moving, pulling on clothes while telling him to call 911 immediately. Every old feeling, every distance, every resentment was shoved aside by the instinct of a nurse and the instinct of a daughter. The hospital was 20 minutes from my house, but that night I made it in 12. By the time I arrived, my mother was already in surgery. She had fractured her hip, which is no small injury at her age. My father was curled into himself on a plastic chair in the hallway, looking so small and lost that I barely recognized him. Then the doctor came over, introduced himself as Dr. Morrison, and gently explained that the surgery would take several hours. But what chilled me was not only my mother's broken hip. During intake, they had also noticed troubling signs in my father: confusion, disorientation, and early indications of cognitive decline. The doctors said something that, with 15 years in geriatric nursing, I understood better than most: they could no longer continue living independently. I knew exactly what that sentence carried with it. Months of rehabilitation, medication, home aids, assisted living, financial paperwork, and savings draining away faster than anyone wants to imagine. I knew that system. I knew how quickly old age can wear down both the body and the bank account. But standing in that hospital hallway, there was one thing I still did not know in my family's eyes. Who would be expected to step forward and carry all of it? The following afternoon, while my mother was still drifting in and out of awareness after surgery, my father motioned for me to sit down beside her hospital bed. After just one night, he looked 10 years older. His shoulders sagged. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his voice was exhausted. Though no longer panicked, he told me that from now on, he and my mother would need real help, not just a few meals or rides to appointments, but someone to manage medications, make sure they were safe, handle medical decisions, and keep a close eye on everything. I listened as both a daughter and someone who understood exactly where this kind of situation was headed. I knew he was right. They were going to need a great deal of support. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're a nurse. This is what you do. Family helps family." I had heard thousands of patients' families say words like that, but never had they landed in my own life with such weight. There was no apology to begin the conversation. No hesitation in asking how much I could realistically help. No acknowledgement that this would be an enormous burden. There was only an almost complete assumption that because I had the skills, because I was dependable, the bulk of the responsibility would naturally fall to me. I asked him one very simple question: "Have you called Victoria?" And that was when the 47 seconds of silence began. I remember counting every beat in my head. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, until the silence stretched so long that it was no longer surprise. It became an answer. Finally, He said Victoria was busy, that she had her own issues. When I asked what issues, he would not say, he just changed the wording, calling her fragile, saying she would not be able to handle something like this. And me, I was the reliable one. The one who did not complain. The one who could carry the weight. In that exact moment, I understood that for 30 years, they had always known who they could truly count on. They had simply never believed that person was worth investing in. What I felt after that conversation was not just pain. It was like the final piece of a puzzle snapping into place, forming a picture I had really seen for years but had refused to name. For the first time in my life, my father called me dependable, but it did not feel like praise. It felt like a late confession. They knew I was the one who would not abandon them. They knew I had the ability, the patience, and a heart big enough to step into a crisis instead of turning away. And instead of valuing that, they had used it as the reason to keep choosing someone else over me. That night, I sat in the kitchen with Marcus. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the numbers I started writing down on a piece of paper. When I am overwhelmed, that is what I do. I turn worry into math. If I quit my job or cut back my hours to care for my parents, I would lose about $65,000 a year. If we hired in-home care, it could cost anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 a month. If we moved them into assisted living, the numbers were hardly any smaller. Marcus asked how much money my parents had left. And that was the moment I realized I did not actually know. I only knew one thing: if Victoria did not help, this entire system would soon collapse onto me. Marcus took my hand and said something I still remember, word for word. You have spent your whole life saying yes to people who never truly saw you. Maybe it's time to ask them why. If my story speaks to you, please like this video so more people can hear stories about boundaries, fairness, and self-respect in families. That night, I asked myself what would happen if I kept saying yes the way I always had. And the answer came into focus with terrifying clarity. I would disappear a little more, and they would not even notice. The next morning, for the first time in 30 years, I called Victoria myself and asked her directly. She answered on the 6th ring, her voice still sleepy, even though it was already 9 in the morning. I told her Mom had fallen and been hospitalized. Dad was showing signs of cognitive decline, and they needed a full-time care plan. Her first reaction was not panic, and not guilt that no one had told her sooner. It was a cold question. So, what do you want me to do? I answered plainly. I want you to share the responsibility. But Victoria let out a sigh as if I were asking something unreasonable. She said she was not good at those things. Not good at caring for elderly people. Not good with paperwork, medical matters, or organizing. She said that was my world, because I was the nurse. I tried to stay calm and reminded her that our parents did not only need someone to manage medications, they also needed money. She immediately said she did not have any. I brought up the $50,000 down payment our parents had once given her for the house. And then I heard another silence, shorter than my father's, but just as heavy. Victoria said she had sold that house 3 years earlier. After the divorce, the ground seemed to shift under my feet. That house, the one our parents had sacrificed so much to help her buy, the one I had once looked at from my cramped rental apartment with that mix of hurt and determination, was gone. When I asked where the money from the sale had gone, she instantly put up a wall and said it was none of my business. But then the truth kept surfacing. She was carrying $89,000 in credit card debt. The most painful part was not that she had failed. Anyone can stumble in life. What hurt was that, after everything she had been given, she still automatically assumed that responsibility for our parents belonged to me. She said I had my perfect little life, that I had never lived under the kind of expectations she had. And for the first time, I realized that the golden child I had grown up watching was not a symbol of success at all. She was someone who had learned how to fail without ever having to pay the full price for it. The call with Victoria did not end there. I called her again several more times because I could not accept that she was dodging responsibility while still casting herself as the victim. Eventually, she answered, sounding exhausted. But this time I did not waste words. I told her we were not finished. I asked why she thought I looked down on her when, for 30 years, I had been the one forced to look up. Victoria answered with complete certainty that I had lived a simpler life, with fewer expectations, that no one had pressured me to be extraordinary. I felt my chest tighten as I listened. She had mistaken my neglect for privilege. In her mind, not being invested in, not being expected to shine, not being supported somehow meant I had been free. I told her about the mortgage I had paid myself, the retirement savings Marcus and I had built on our own, the years I worked 2 jobs just to finish nursing school. I was not saying it to brag. I just wanted her to understand that my stability was not a gift from our parents. It was the result of countless times I had to pick myself up and keep going. But Victoria answered with the line that made the truth of everything clearer than ever: she did not know how to become what other people needed. I told her that if she did not know, then she had to learn. Because all of us had been forced to learn something in order to survive. She was simply the only one who had always been excused from truly growing up. By the time I hung up, I had made a quiet decision. I would help my parents, but not in the way they had always expected. I would not step back into the role of the fallback child without demanding that the truth be called by its real name. What Victoria did not know, what none of them knew then, was that just one day later, I would find handwritten proof of the injustice that had stretched across all those years. And from that moment on, this story would no longer be only about feelings or memory. It would become dates, numbers, and money recorded carefully enough that no one could pretend not to see it anymore. The next morning, I went to my parents' house to gather a few things for the hospital clothes for my father, my mother's reading glasses, and their insurance papers. That familiar house felt strangely foreign without my mother's daily care holding it together. There were still dishes in the sink, stacks of unopened mail by the door, and the air smelled of dust and old coffee, as if everything had already started to decay after just one fall. I went into my father's office to look for the insurance documents and opened the old metal filing cabinet that had been there since I was a child. That was where my hand touched a worn leather notebook. On the first page, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "Family Records." I knew I probably should not open it. It felt like stepping into something private, but something in me pushed me to turn the first page. Then I saw columns of dates, names, and amounts. My mother had kept meticulous records starting in 1985 Victoria College tuition. Sishimayuan. Ling Ling Ling. Victoria graduation car. Sharmayuan. Lining Ling. Victoria wedding. Bashawumeyuan. Ling Ling Ling. Victoria house down payment. Wushimayuan. Ling Ling Ling. Page after page. There were also birthday gifts. Emergency loans never repaid. A trip to Europe. Interview clothes. Dental work. Credit card payments. Then I turned to my section. Half a page. Wedding gift. Armayuan. Linening. Baby shower. Senbaimeyuan. Kitchen appliances. One Christmas. Sibaimeyuan. I added it up. Then checked again. In the end, the numbers sat there so clearly that I had to sit down. Victoria had received about $342. 000 over 40 years. I had received $7. Sibay. On the last page, there was one more note. Written just 3 months earlier, Victoria called. Needs $15. 000. Urgently. Harold says no more. I don't know what to do. My hands were shaking. But my mind felt strangely calm. I took out my phone and photographed every page. It was no longer a feeling, no longer just something that seemed unfair. My mother had documented all of it in her own handwriting. I kept searching through the other files in the cabinet. And what I found after the notebook made my stomach tighten even more. There were bank statements, investment accounts, insurance records, pieces of the entire financial structure my parents would need to survive the rest of their lives. Their current savings were around $127. Ling ling ling. To someone on the outside, that might sound like a decent amount, but to me, after 15 years working in elder care, I knew how fragile that number really was. I pulled out the withdrawal records one by one, and the pattern became impossible to miss. Every few months, money disappeared. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, sometimes as much as 20,000. Almost all of it led back to the same name, Victoria. In just the last 10 years, my parents had withdrawn more than $200. 000 to rescue her from one crisis after another. Divorce. Starting over. Debt. Holes she still had not managed to fill. They had almost no long-term care insurance. Medicare would help with short-term hospital-related costs, but it would not cover nursing home care or long-term in-home care. I called Diane Reeves, a longtime colleague who runs a memory care facility. After listening to everything, she went quiet for a few seconds before telling me that with the level of care my parents now needed, that amount of money would last only about 12 to 18 months in a decent place. After that, they would be looking at Medicaid. Asset spend down. Complicated paperwork, and one painful decision after another. Diane also told me something crucial: the hospital would hold a family meeting before discharging my parents. They would require a clear care plan, including who was responsible for what, both practically and financially. After I hung up, I sat alone in that dusty room, surrounded by 40 years of lopsided love translated into numbers. I understood then that this was no longer a story I could swallow the way I always had before. If I walked into that meeting unprepared, the old system would swallow me whole all over again. That evening, I spread all the documents across the kitchen table in my house. Marcus sat across from me, silently reading through every printed copy of the photos I had taken. He did not say much, but I could see the restrained anger in his eyes when he stopped at the total amount Victoria had received compared to me. $342,000 versus $7,400. We did not need to comment much, because the numbers spoke loudly enough on their own. I began scanning the most important pages again and saving digital copies in several different places. For the first time in my life, I was not carrying only a vague, aching hurt. I was carrying proof. Then I called Thomas Bradley, an elder law attorney Marcus knew through a former job. I asked whether anyone at the hospital meeting could force me to promise that I would take on all the responsibility. He explained that meetings like that do not create an immediate legal obligation. But what is said there does get recorded. The social worker would keep notes. Care facilities would look at how cooperative the family appeared to be, what financial commitments were made, and who was identified as the primary point of contact. In other words, nothing said in that room would be meaningless. If I stayed silent while everyone assumed I would handle everything, that silence could later become reality on paper and in the way people treated me from that point forward. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, 4 days away. I called Victoria and left a message telling her she had to attend, at least by video. I told her not to make me explain why. Truthfully, at that point, I was not interested in revenge. I did not want to start a war just to satisfy my anger. I only wanted something my family had never truly faced before: clarity. After 30 years of being looked through as though I were not there, I wanted everyone, just once, to look directly at the truth, and I knew that if I wanted that to happen, I could not walk into that room with my heart exposed and empty-handed. I had to walk in carrying the truth itself. On Thursday morning, I entered the family meeting room at the hospital with the feeling that I was stepping into a place so neutral it was almost cold. While knowing the words spoken inside it could change our relationships forever. The room was beige, lit by harsh fluorescent lights, with a long rectangular table, stiff chairs, and a large screen mounted on the wall for video calls. Marcus sat beside me, and just having his hand near mine was enough to remind me I was not alone. My father wheeled my mother in shortly afterward. She looked smaller in her hospital gown, but her eyes were clearer than I had expected. Dr. Morrison came in with Rachel Smith, the hospital social worker. Then the screen flickered on, revealing Victoria's carefully made-up face, sitting in an elegant living room. My two aunts joined the call as well. The doctor briefly summarized my parents' condition. My mother needed rehabilitation after surgery. My father was showing signs of cognitive decline, and they could no longer continue living independently. Rachel explained that the purpose of the meeting was to establish a discharge plan who would provide financial support and who would handle the practical responsibilities. The atmosphere in the room shifted the moment that question was asked. Victoria immediately spoke up before anyone else. She said she wanted transparency, that she and her new husband were going through financial difficulties after her divorce and remarriage, and that things were genuinely not easy for them. One of my aunts even nodded sympathetically. Then Rachel turned toward me. But before I could even open my mouth, Victoria cut in. "Tori can do it." She said it with a level of certainty so casual it hurt. She said I was a nurse, that I was used to handling situations like this, and that my lifestyle was less pressured. My father nodded along. My mother looked down at her hands. In that exact moment, I realized that if I did not speak, the role they had written for me long ago would once again close around my life like an old trap. Familiar and effective. I took a deep breath and said that before deciding who would give what from this point forward, I wanted to talk about what had already been given in the past. The room went completely still. Victoria froze on the screen, and my father shifted in his chair as if he wanted to cut me off immediately. He said that had nothing to do with the matter at hand. But I knew it had everything to do with it. How could we talk about fairness now, while pretending to forget the 30 or 40 years of imbalance that had brought the family to this exact moment? Victoria started protesting, saying I was bringing up money when our mother had just come out of surgery. But I did not raise my voice. I simply said, very calmly, that she was claiming she could not help. And if that was true, then everyone in the room needed to understand why. I asked her directly what had happened to the house our parents had once helped her buy. She snapped that it was none of my business. But Rachel, in her professional way, stepped in and said that perhaps the whole room needed to understand the full financial picture. I saw Victoria's expression change instantly. It was not exactly shame. It looked more like fear of being exposed. I reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of photocopied documents I had brought. I said I had found them by accident when I went to the house to collect the insurance papers. My mother looked up for the first time since the meeting had begun. I opened the pages and said that this was her handwriting, and that she had recorded every dollar given to her children since 1985. Then I began reading aloud. Victoria's college tuition, her graduation car, her wedding, the down payment for her house, emergency help, loans that were never repaid. The total came to around $342. Ling ling ling. Then I read my section $7. Sibai. It felt as though every sound in the room had been sucked away. One of my aunts covered her mouth. Rachel looked up from her notes. My father stared as if he were seeing those numbers for the first time. And then my mother spoke. weak but unmistakably clear, saying that yes, she had written it all down. Every dollar, every date. It was the truth. In that room, there was no longer any space left to avoid it. Victoria reacted immediately. She said I was trying to turn myself into some kind of martyr, trying to prove I was the perfect victim. She said the money had been for opportunities, for emergencies, for things she had needed more. My mother shrank into herself but did not deny it. I turned and looked at her, wondering how many years she had stared at those columns of numbers and still managed to convince herself this was fair love. Victoria went on, saying I had never needed as much as she had, that I had always been fine. That sentence landed directly on the oldest wound I had. I was not fine because I had been protected. I was fine because I had never been given any other choice. Then I revealed something else. Something I had learned only the day before Victoria had sold the house. Our parents helped her buy 3 years earlier and was now buried under $89. 0 inches credit card debt, she erupted, saying I had no right to say that. But I answered very clearly that the moment she declared she could contribute nothing toward our parents' care, it became the family's business. No one argued anymore about whether I was exaggerating, because everything was there on paper. My 2 aunts were stunned. My father looked down at the floor. My mother cried. Victoria's new husband stepped briefly into the camera frame and then backed out again, clearly unable to keep pretending this was all under control. I was not speaking to humiliate her. I was speaking because, for the first time in my life, I wanted the truth to stand in the middle of the room instead of all the old roles. Victoria said I was trying to shame her, but I just shook my head. No, I said. I am only telling the truth for the first time in 30 years. And the truth was, what hurt her was not my words. What hurt her was that the image of the successful daughter could no longer hide a life built on endless favoritism. And for me, standing in that room, my voice steady, my hands no longer shaking, I suddenly understood something that mattered more than anything else. I was no longer afraid to speak. What had once made me smaller no longer had the power to force me into silence. Once the numbers were laid on the table, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Rachel returned to her role and began outlining the options: direct family caregiving, assisted living, or hiring in-home nursing care. No one volunteered to be the full-time caregiver. My father inhaled sharply with worry when he heard the cost of appropriate facilities. Victoria even asked whether my parents' current house should be sold, as if it were simply an asset waiting to be liquidated. That time, it was my father who reacted as if he had been slapped. I looked at her and realized the greatest difference between the two of us. I was thinking about how to help our parents keep what little they still had at the end of their lives, while she had already begun calculating what was left for her to take. When Rachel asked how I was willing to help, I stood up. Not to be dramatic, but simply to feel my feet firmly on the ground. I said clearly that I would help coordinate the entire care plan because I had the professional knowledge. I understood the system, and I genuinely wanted to help. Marcus and I would contribute $1, $500 a month. I would visit my parents regularly, manage their medications, and serve as the main medical point of contact. But I also said something my family had probably never heard from me before: I would not quit my job. I would not bring my parents into my home. And I would not pretend this arrangement was fair if I was the only one contributing. I looked directly at the screen and told Victoria that she had to find a way to contribute something. Even if it was only $200 a month or a few visits. She could not continue being a zero in all of this. For the first time in 30 years, she had no sharp reply ready. My father lowered his head and admitted that he had not realized things were this uneven. And I answered him with the coldest truth of all: yes. You did. Because Mom wrote every bit of it down. My mother broke into sobs and said she had always thought Victoria needed more. while I was the one who always seemed strong. I told her I was strong because they had never given me any other choice. It was not a moment of triumph. It was painful. But it was freeing. Because for the first time I had finally spoken aloud everything I had swallowed for 30 years. After that meeting, nothing magically became perfect. But for the first time, things started becoming real. A week later, my mother was transferred to a rehabilitation facility, while my father stayed temporarily with Aunt Linda so someone could keep an eye on him while we searched for a long-term solution. Diane and I compared several appropriate facilities. And in the end, we chose an assisted living community that could handle both my mother's needs and my father's cognitive decline. The cost was about $7. $200 a month. I had committed to $1. Ubai. My parents' savings covered most of the rest. And then something happened that I had never dared to expect. Victoria agreed to send $1. $200 a month. Not because she had suddenly become a perfect person, but because for the first time she was no longer able to run from the consequences. 6 months passed, and my parents gradually settled into their new home. My mother recovered well. My father had good days and bad days. But overall, he was safe and cared for. Victoria sent the money regularly and visited twice. Those visits were still awkward, and our relationship could not honestly be called warm. She never gave me a full apology. And eventually, I realized I no longer needed to wait for one. My father had a private conversation with me in the garden at the care facility. He told me he finally understood that he had spent his life investing everything in one stock while leaving the other to survive on its own. He said I had been the better investment all along. But he had been too blind to see it. It was not a perfect apology, but it was the first truly sincere thing I had ever heard from him. As for me, the most important thing I learned was not how to win a family meeting. It was that I did not need to wait for anyone else's recognition before I could start seeing myself clearly. I am still the dependable one, the practical one, the resilient one. But now I know those are not supporting character traits. They are strength. And for the first time in my life, I used that strength to protect myself. If this story speaks to you, if you have ever been the child who was always assumed to be fine, the backup plan, the one expected to be strong because no one else was willing to hold you up, then subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the stories that come next. You deserve to be seen, to be heard, and to live without having to make yourself smaller just to fit inside someone else's favoritism.